say that they really help somebody, and you don't realize it. But what we say and do has an impact on others. So we have to really know how to encourage people and not always put them down. And also this word is used in a positive sense. It's encouraged or stimulated. So our goal here is this progression is expressing this compound of love and good works. So we want to encourage love, we want to do good works towards others. It also talks about corporate worship. Corporate worship is important because worship together with other believers. You know, many of them had abandoned the habit of meeting. And some still today think it's possible to live in the Christian life and abandon the habit of coming together with worship. We had our struggles in 2020 of not being able to come together to worship. We had to find other means of worshiping, and in not being able to come together, some fell on the wayside. When we come back, some didn't come back. But we have to know the importance of worship. Coming together, you know, you can say, but you have to come together and give God worship in His presence and in His sanctuary. God made us to be in a community. So this exhortation takes on a sense of urgency, you see. It says the day is approaching, which means the day is at hand. The second coming of Christ is really on the way. So in that time, it's our duty to do all the good we can to build all the people we can in all the ways that we can. You know, in this present day, the world and unfortunately the church is characterized by rugged individualism. But this verse was a reminder that no one is at liberty to end all their problems on themselves. They just always think about ourselves. We are all bound to consider our neighbors as well as our brothers and sisters in Christ. It does consider the basic concept of careful consideration, thoughtful attention, and deep concern. And it's followed by the word one another, expressing the mutual sympathy of members of the Christian community in the act of careful consideration. All about meeting together regularly in the church. Remind yourself that we're indeed one body. We're individuals working as one whole, and it's a profession of God, true love, nature. So, this unity, as I said, must be practiced. We must work it over and over, and again, by meeting together with fellow believers. Because when we worship together, we encourage ourselves and each other. We warn ourselves and one another of sin and dangers of backsliding, and we remind ourselves and our fellow believers of how we should behave as Christians, and that we must watch over one another. We need one another and each other's gifts and talents. So we must encourage one another to love and to do good deeds. And then we get into our second outline. Verse 26. It says it in receiving the knowledge of truth, which means entering into the community that's defined by the true God. The people to whom this epistle was written, they know what God has done in Christ, and their acquaintance with Christian teaching is more than sufficient. Just as Israel, every well acquainted with God and His covenant. So they revert to an attitude of rejection or of sin, then there remains no sacrifice to cover those sins. So the important word here is willfully. They did it willfully, knowing what they were doing, knowing they turned against God. And it says that it was an apostasy, which means turning away from Christ. and the faith of the gospel. So they willfully turned away from Christ. They turned away from the faith of the gospel. And when a believer freely chooses sin, it's not a minor transgression, but an apostasy, as I said, and it's a deliberate and voluntary turning away. And there's no hope of forgiveness. All that they can expect is judgment, and they will receive judgment from Christ for their sins. It's to sin willfully. As I said, to turn away from Christ after we have come to Him, it carries a terrible consequence. And, you have the consequence of being cut off from positive benefits of Jesus' sacrifices for sins. So, but the one who is truly saved, sanctified, full of the Holy Ghost, would never be guilty of the apostate turning away from Jesus Christ and the faith of the gospel. So we have to stay sanctified and stay, as I said, fast on in our faith, and do not willfully turn away from Him. And that is the knowledge of the truth, and the truth is the gospel of Christ. So do not falter or turn away from Christ, or there will be one judgment. Because salvation is through accepting Christ. And He will pass judgment on all of us one day, as He reigns. He judges everyone. We get into our third outline. How God will judge His people, verses 20 through 31. For we know judgment belongs to God, for the Lord shall judge His people. There is no other sacrifice for sin except Christ's sacrifice on the cross, as I mentioned before. And whoever rejects God's mercy will receive God's judgment. In verses 28 and 29, the Jews, they held the laws of Moses to be divinely given. Anyone who rejected God's direction and was killed without compassion. There was no place for mercy. So the author here invites us to work it out for ourselves. What sort of a worse punishment someone would deserve for rejecting the gift of God in Christ? Because Jesus is greater than Moses, so it must be more severe than under the old way. So, whatever punishment Moses gave in death or whatever God would give will be more severe, because when you're rejecting Christ, it's got to be more severe than rejecting Moses. So you're looking at eternal death, burning in the fire for eternity, over and over again. And in this, he mentions 3 phases of the apostasy in verse 29. Anybody know what the phase in verse 29, what the phases are? The first one says that that person has trodden underfoot the Son of God. That he is not only rejecting Christ, but also despising Him. And then, this right here is more falling from grace. It's a mockery of the giver of grace. And the second characterization is that the apostate takes lightly the solemn shedding of covenant blood. It says, "We have trodden under the foot of the Son of God, counted the blood of a covenant." So He treats the death of Jesus just like the death of any other man. And the word common, can also be understood as against the holy. And it does come to mean that there's unhallowed and unholy. So this stands out more when it is remembered that this blood has sanctified. So to go back and on the act to deny the significance of the blood and to see it as a common thing. And the third thing was that he or she has done despitefully, or it's done despite unto the Spirit of grace. So that means reduce the honor that's due. And a willful sin, that's an insult to the Spirit. It brings the grace of God to humanity. And these two verses, they function together as a lesser to a greater form of argument, which has been consistently used throughout this entire composition, both for exhortation and exposition. Here, the writer argues that those who set aside Christ's sacrifice will suffer great punishment in comparison to those who rejected the laws of Moses, who were to be killed without compassion. And the author appeals to the reader's imagination to suppose the kind of judgment or worse punishment one would deserve when they reject the gifts of God. And the willful sinner, who was previously a Christian, has treated the precious and sacred blood of Christ in inauguration with a new covenant by which he was sanctified as something common and profane or an unholy thing. So it is the height of the arrogance by this sinner, and it's an arrogance that will demand nothing short or less than a dreadful and certain penalty. And in verse 30 and 31, the author's quotation here is goes back to those from Deuteronomy 32 and 35. So, you know him that have said, vengeance belongeth to me. So here it should, God speaks to all men. These authors from Deuteronomy, he's speaking of God's judgment on the enemies of Israel. And the author here applies these quotations as a warning concerning God judging his own people. But then the emphasis here is on the certainty that the Lord will act. And he cannot hope to go unpunished, because avenging wrong is in the hands of God. And then the second quotation is from Deuteronomy 32 and 36. It needs no doubt that whatever about the Lord's inhibition, for he is named, and so is his activity. So a person that claims to be a member of the people of God does not exempt him or her from judgment. Said God judges all. He judges, his judgment reigns on the just as well as the unjust. Falling into the hands of someone means to come under his power. We refer back to Judges 15 and 18. There are two passages in the Old Testament that say that it is better to fall into the hands of the Lord than into the hands of man. You can find that in 2 Samuel 4:14, 1 Chronicles 21 and 13. In those passages, they provide reassurance of God's mercy. But such as it is not the case in this passage. Rather, falling into God's hands here would be dreadful and fearsome, because they are talking about the willful sinners. And so he will pass judgment on them, and it will not be for a time, but for an eternity. Then we move on into our fourth outline, looking forward through suffering, verses 32 and 36. The judgment day for God's faithful followers who suffer with patience and receive the seat of all God has promised. The judgment day will be coming. The years of this letter were living in between the times of the days of their enlightenment and the day of the Lord. And they were to remember the great fight of afflictions or the great sufferings that they endured. And it was to remind them of the experience that shaped their identity. Their experience in the former days are to continue to serve as a counterpoint to the suffering and the temptations that they were currently facing, particularly the temptation of turning away and neglecting the assemblies. And the nature of the sufferings of the Hebrew Christian is spelled out here. They suffered publicly. They suffered public exposure to insult and persecution. And their reproach for their insult, it indicates here verbal abuse, usually in the form of public jeering and scoffing. And it was used to describe the treatment of Jesus as well as the early Christian. And they showed concern for those that were in prison. They had experienced having their property confiscated by the authorities. But in the midst of all these trials that they went through, they maintained a positive disposition. And that was grounded in certainty and perception of reality. They maintained their faith. But the Christian spirit, is a sympathizing spirit. It's not a selfish spirit, but a compassionate spirit. And it makes every Christian suffering our own. So our Christian spirit shows mercy to others by visiting them, helping them, and pleading with and for them. So Christians are one body. We're motivated by one spirit, with one common cause and interest. And we are the children of that God, who is afflicted with all the afflictions of his penalties. So if one member of the body suffers, all the rest will suffer with it, just as Christ suffered with us. And in verses 35 and 36, here the audience of this letter, they were given confidence and boldness in their confession of Christ. The author is now urging them not to throw or cast it away. Those who hold fast to their confession, they will have a great recompense of reward. That is, they will be richly rewarded. So there is no indication that they have already done so in this lesson, but they are clearly being tempted to do so. So do not cast away. Do not throw away your faith. Stand bold for God. They are not to throw their confidence and boldness away because it possesses a great reward. And that reward is our eternal salvation. This is why it's called a great reward. And we all, as Christians, are looking forward to that day to get our great reward, our eternal salvation that God has promised us. In verse 36, our last verse, it provides the grounds for this preceding exhortation, and does so in a counterpart fashion by putting patience against casting away. And patience denotes perseverance. It denotes remaining faithful to the end. In Christ, he has showed us perfect biblical perseverance, and we are exhorted to fix our eyes on him as our model. So we have to put Christ as a model for us to help us to hold fast to him and to persevere through all storms and all trials. I've heard it said before that if we are in a storm, we have either just come out of one or we're about to go into one. And so we know that following Christ is not easy. It's not easy in the beginning, it's not easy throughout the whole thing. But we will have struggles, trials, and heartaches. But we must still have faith. And 1 Timothy 6:12 says, we are in a spiritual battle, and we need to fight the good fight of faith. Hebrews 12:1 says we are called to run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So whatever lies ahead, we must press on and keep going. And this lesson today has given us ways to help us to preserve our faith. So we recap, it tells us to draw near to God, to hold fast to the hope we profess, Just have a firm grip on the promises that God wants, on the promises that keeps us going. We should consider how we may encourage one another on towards love and good deeds, because it's our corporate responsibility to encourage each other. And we learn not to give up meeting together, because that brings support, strength, and perspective, which helps to preserve our faith. And last, we must encourage one another. And that could be the difference between someone giving up or persevering. So it's a good lesson to learn how to hold fast to our faith today. So when you build others up through encouragement, you begin to see greater unity and strength within the church. And this will enable us to not only simply survive and sustain, but it will enable us to thrive and to live life to the full as Jesus promised us in John 10 and 10. So thank you for this good lesson today. And this should be the prayer of every Savior, that every believer might possess strong, living, patient, and preserving faith. And just remember, God is greater than our situations and is faithful through it all. On behalf of Burwell and Downtown Primitive Baptist Church, I thank you for joining us this morning for our Sunday school lesson of preserving faith. May God bless you and continue to keep you. Romans 12, 21, and something today's lesson was a preserving faith. Last week was preserving. One teacher, 13, adult, 10 down classes, so important. 9 down classes, so important. And yes, here's the red. Those song, God bless our church. Those song, God bless our church. Dr. Miles Burwell, our beloved active secretary of the Board of Directors, and the total office was $35.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Lord, as it is in heaven, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespass, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, power, and the glory, forever. Amen. God bless you.
We encourage you to join us next Sunday.